Welcome to the deep dive, where we kind of extract the good stuff, the important knowledge from some fascinating topics, and it's all tailored for you, the listener.
Yeah, we like to think of it as cutting through the clutter.
Exactly. And
Oh!
today we're diving deep into the world of social psychology. We've got this book, Experiments with People, Revelations from Social Psychology by Robert Abelson.
It's a treasure trove of research. Really fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. And our mission, what we really want to get to the bottom of in this deep dive, is how our minds work, why we do the things we do, why we believe what we believe.
And the power of social influence, that's a big one. It's often invisible, but man, it's strong.
Totally. Think of this deep dive as your guide to, to understanding how people tick. We're going to explore all sorts of foundational studies, like Quattrone and Tversky's work on self-deception, Wagner's research on mental control.
Porta's insights on familiarity. Oh, and Twenge's research on social exclusion. Powerful stuff.
Lots to unpack. So are you ready to understand yourself and the people around you a little bit better?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so right off the bat, Abelson makes a point in the introduction that I think is really important. We all have these theories about why we think and act the way we do.
Our everyday intuitive understanding.
Right. But it turns out we're often way off.
Our common sense theories, as intuitive as they feel, are often just plain inaccurate.
I like how Abelson used the analogy of a patient and a physician. Like you as the patient, you know your own experiences, your thoughts, but that doesn't make you an expert on what's causing those experiences.
Exactly. Familiarity doesn't equal expertise. Just because you experience something doesn't mean you fully understand the mechanisms behind it.
Right. There's a study mentioned in the book where participants, they had to evaluate this hypothetical crisis center worker named Jill.
And afterwards, they were asked what influenced their rating of Jill. Like what specific attributes of hers stood out.
And get this, there was a big difference between what actually influenced their opinions. The researchers could tell this based on how they designed the study and what the participants thought had influenced them.
They were often totally unaware of the real drivers behind their judgments.
So it makes you wonder, right? Are we really experts on our own minds just because we live in them?
It's a great question, and it brings up the central idea in social psychology. The real causes of our behavior, well, they're often unconscious.
And it's not just about what's happening inside our heads. The social context, the environment we're in, plays a huge role too.
Right. Instead of attributing everything to some internal instinct like Freud's death instinct, a social psychologist might look at, say, social pressure, the need to fit in.
Or obedience to authority. That's a big one.
Absolutely. And here's another interesting thing. The book talks about how even introspection, looking inward, can sometimes lead to bad decisions. There's this study where some people were asked to analyze their reasons for liking or disliking certain art posters.
And you know what? Later on, when they were given a poster to take home, the people who had introspected, they were actually less satisfied with their choice a few weeks later.
It seems that overthinking our reasons can mess with our gut feelings, our initial intuition.
So maybe sometimes it's better to trust your gut.
Maybe so.
Okay, so we've talked about how we're not always aware of why we do what we do. Now let's talk about memory.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
The book has this concept of mythical memories, which is basically the idea that our beliefs about our past experiences don't always match up with what really happened.
Our intuitive theories versus reality.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating research on menstrual distress where they found that women's beliefs about how bad their symptoms were, like pain, water retention, and mood swings.
Those beliefs were way more intense than what their actual daily reports showed.
So they thought they were feeling way worse than they actually were.
And it suggests that societal beliefs, those stereotypes about periods, can actually shape how women remember or anticipate their experience.
Wow. It's like a form of false memory, where our expectations color our recollections.
And this idea connects to the whole debate about how malleable memory can be. The book talks about the recovered memory controversy and the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who showed how easy it is to implant false memories.
Right, and there's that famous study where people confidently remember words that were never actually on the list they saw.
The key takeaway is that just because you feel certain about a memory doesn't mean it's accurate.
That's kind of scary, actually. So our memories can be unreliable, and we're not always aware of our own motivations. What about predicting our future feelings?
Well, that brings us to the psychological immune system.
That sounds intriguing.
It is. It's this idea that we tend to overestimate how long our feelings will last, especially negative ones. We have this unconscious mechanism, sort of like our physical immune system, that helps us bounce back from bad experiences.
So we might think we'll be devastated for months after a breakup, but we often recover much faster.
Exactly. And because this immune system works behind the scenes, we often don't factor it in when we're imagining how we'll feel in the future.
The book describes a study where people were rejected in a job interview and their happiness levels were tracked. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So these psychology students predicted how they'd feel immediately after being rejected and then 10 minutes later. Then they reported their actual feelings at those times. The interesting part is that they also manipulated whether the rejection came from one person or a whole panel. The idea being that rejection from multiple people might be harder to rationalize, harder to dismiss, and it might challenge that psychological immune system.
So did people accurately predict how they'd feel?
Well, they were pretty good at predicting the direction of their feelings. They knew they'd be bummed out, but they consistently overestimated how long those feelings would last. That's the durability bias. We overestimate the durability of our emotions.
Like we forget about our own resilience. Okay, so we're not great at predicting our future feelings. Now let's talk about how we perceive the world around us.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it turns out that believing is seeing. We actively construct our own reality.
That's a powerful statement.
It is, and there's a classic study about a Dartmouth-Princeton football game that perfectly illustrates this. Students from each university watched the same game, but when they were asked about the rough plays, their interpretations were wildly different.
No way.
Oh yeah. Princeton students saw Dartmouth as the aggressors, committing way more penalties, but Dartmouth students saw a more balanced game. They both saw what they wanted to see.
It's amazing how our existing loyalties, like to our school or political party, can shape how we see even objective events.
Absolutely. And these biased perceptions are everywhere. Kids arguing on the playground, couples disagreeing about chores, political debates.
It's all filtered through our own lenses.
Right. And this also applies to how we view media coverage of controversial issues. There's this thing called the hostile media phenomenon.
What's that?
So, people with strong opinions on a topic, even if they think they're well-informed, tend to see media coverage as biased against their view no matter what.
So basically everyone thinks the media is against them.
Pretty much. Our beliefs act like filters, influencing what we notice and how we make sense of it.
That's why it's so important to get information from diverse sources and be aware of our own biases.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, let's move on to how the way choices are presented to us, the framing, can really affect our decisions.
This is where prospect theory comes in, developed by Kahneman and Tversky. It's about how we make decisions when there's risk involved.
Give us an example.
Okay, imagine you get $20,000. Then you have to choose between definitely giving back $5,000 or taking a 50-50 chance of giving back either $10,000 or nothing.
That's tough.
Most people go for the gamble. But here's the thing. If you frame the choice differently, as receiving $15,000 for sure versus a 50-50 chance of receiving either $10,000 or $20,000, people usually choose the guaranteed $15,000.
But it's the same outcome.
Exactly. The actual financial result is the same, but just changing the wording completely flips people's preferences.
So how we frame the choice affects what we choose, even when the options are objectively the same.
Precisely. It highlights this idea of loss aversion. We hate losing more than we love winning.
So we take more risks to avoid a loss than to secure an equal gain.
Exactly. And this framing effect shows up everywhere, not just with money.
Like with health behaviors, right?
Yep. Messages about disease prevention, like using mouthwash, are more effective when they focus on the gains. Prevent gum disease, healthier gums.
And messages about disease detection, like using a disclosing rinse, work better when they focus on the losses. Fail to detect plaque, risk gum disease. So you have to tailor the message based on whether it's about avoiding something bad or getting something good.
Right. And then there's the availability bias, where we overestimate the likelihood of things that easily come to mind, and psychic budgets, which is how we mentally categorize our spending.
Like if you're buying a car, you might be more willing to splurge on extras because it's all part of that car budget.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
all about framing. Okay, let's talk about cognitive dissonance now.
Cognitive dissonance. That uncomfortable feeling you get when your beliefs and actions clash.
We all hate that.
Right. And we're motivated to reduce that discomfort, often by changing our beliefs to match our actions.
There's a classic study about this, right?
Yep, the Festinger and Carl Smith study. People did a boring task and then were paid either $1 or $20 to lie and tell the next participant that the task was actually fun.
And the people who were paid less actually ended up liking the task more. That doesn't make sense.
It seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it. The people who got $20 had a good reason to lie. They were paid well. But the $1 group, they had very little external justification. So to reduce the dissonance, they unconsciously shifted their attitude and actually started to believe that the task was kind of enjoyable.
It's like their minds were saying, well, I must have liked it at least a little if I lied for just $1.
Exactly. It shows that our actions can actually influence our beliefs, especially when we don't have a strong external reason for those actions.
That's pretty profound. And the book even talks about how this concept can be used for indoctrination.
Right. They give the example of American prisoners of war in Korea. The Chinese communists got them to do small acts of cooperation, like agreeing with mildly pro-communist statements. Then they gradually escalated the magnitude of those actions.
So it was like a slippery slope.
Yeah, by getting the soldiers to act in ways that went against their beliefs, they created dissonance. And to resolve that dissonance, some of the soldiers actually started to shift their political beliefs.
So even seemingly insignificant actions can add up and influence our deepest convictions.
Exactly.
The book also talks about self-perception theory, which is the idea that we figure out our attitudes by observing our own behavior.
Right. The current thinking is that both dissonance and self-perception play a role. Dissonance is stronger when we do something that really goes against our beliefs, while self-perception is more relevant for milder inconsistencies.
And then there's the effort justification effect, which is the tendency to like things more if we've worked hard for them.
Like those intense fraternity and sorority initiations, people go through those awful rituals and then end up valuing the group even more.
It's like they're telling themselves, I wouldn't have gone through all that if this group wasn't really special.
Exactly. And this ties into the sunk cost fallacy, where we stick with things, even bad movies or failing projects, just because we've already invested so much.
We hate admitting we were wrong.
It's tough.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about motivation.
Motivation can be intrinsic, meaning you do something because you enjoy it, or extrinsic, meaning you do something to get a reward or avoid punishment.
I think we often assume that rewards are the best way to motivate people.
We do, but there's research that shows that's not always the case. The book talks about a study with kids drawing pictures. The ones who were promised a reward for drawing actually did worse and were less interested in drawing later on.
That's so counterintuitive.
It is. But the idea is that when you introduce the expectation of a reward, the focus shifts from the joy of the activity to the reward itself. And once the reward is gone, the motivation disappears.
So rewarding a kid for drawing might actually make them less interested in art in the long run.
It's possible.
The book does point out that praise is different though, right?
Yes, genuine praise, when it's not tied to conditions, can be good. It tells you about your abilities, not just about getting a reward.
That makes sense. Okay, we've talked about motivation. What about self-deception? The ways we sometimes fool ourselves.
The book talks about motivated self-deception, where we unconsciously twist our perceptions to maintain a positive self-image.
Like those Calvinists who believed in predestination but still tried to live virtuous lives.
Exactly. They might have been deceiving themselves into believing they were among the chosen ones. And there's this fascinating study by Quattrone and Tversky about a bogus medical exam.
Tell me more about that one.
So, participants took this fake exam that they thought could predict heart disease risk. Part of the exam involved holding their hand in ice water.
Sounds unpleasant.
It was. But here's the thing. They manipulated what participants were told about the link between cold tolerance and heart health. Some were told that high tolerance meant a healthy heart. Others were told the opposite.
Okay, so what happened?
During a second round of the cold water test, participants unconsciously changed their pain tolerance based on what they thought indicated a healthy heart.
Wow, so they actually changed their physical reaction based on this belief.
Yep. And they weren't even aware they were doing it. It shows how powerfully motivated we are to see ourselves positively.
That's incredible. The book also mentions defensive self-handicapping. What's that about?
It's where we create obstacles to our own success as a way to protect our self-esteem, like staying out late before a big exam so you have an excuse if you do badly.
It's like saying, I didn't fail because I'm not smart. I failed because I didn't get enough sleep.
Exactly. It's a way to shield our egos.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on to another mind-bending concept. The ironic processes of mental control.
Oh, yeah. This is where we see that trying not to think about something can actually make you think about it more. The classic white bear problem.
I've definitely experienced that.
We all have. The book talks about a study where people were told to regulate their mood while also trying to remember a 9-digit number. So they were under cognitive load.
I mean, it happened.
When they tried to improve their mood, they actually felt worse. And when they tried to worsen their mood, they felt better.
That doesn't make sense.
It's counterintuitive, but it has to do with these two processes that are at play when we try to control our thoughts. There's the intentional part, where we consciously try to achieve the desired mental state. And then there's this unconscious monitoring process that's scanning for the very thoughts we're trying to suppress.
So it was like a mental tug of war.
Kind of. And under cognitive load, that conscious part weakens, so the monitoring process takes over and inadvertently brings the unwanted thoughts to the surface.
So if you're stressed and trying not to think about something, it might actually make it worse.
It's possible. It's why those unwanted thoughts can be so persistent.
Makes sense. Okay, let's switch gears to something more straightforward. The mere exposure effect.
Ah, the power of familiarity. This is the idea that we tend to like things more simply because we've been exposed to them repeatedly.
Like that song you hated at first, but now you love it because it's been on the radio constantly.
Exactly. There's a classic study where people were shown normal and reversed images of their own face and a friend's face.
And they preferred the reversed image of their own face, but the normal image of their friend's face. Why is that?
Because we're used to seeing ourselves in the mirror, which is a reversed image. So the reversed image feels more familiar to us. But we usually see our friends' faces directly, so the normal image feels more familiar for them.
That's so interesting. So familiarity can really breed liking.
It can.
Okay, we've been talking about our own minds. But how good are we at understanding other people?
Well, the book suggests that even experts in human behavior, even people like Freud, have limitations. We're prone to all sorts of biases. Like, we often jump to attributing someone's behavior to their personality without considering the situation.
Right, we forget that people are influenced by their environment too.
Exactly. And here's a good example of our limited understanding. We're terrible at detecting lies.
Really?
Yep. Even trained professionals like police officers are barely better than chance at spotting liars.
Huh, I would have thought they'd be better at that.
It's a common misconception. So it's good to be humble when judging others, and remember there's often more to the story than we see.
So if we're not great at understanding others through observation, how do social psychologists study these things?
Well, they have all sorts of clever methods, like they use these things called sequential priming tasks. It's a way to uncover hidden stereotypes and prejudices that people might not even be aware of or might not want to admit.
Like a subconscious bias test.
Exactly. For example, they might flash a picture of a black or white face and then a word, and the participant has to quickly categorize the word as positive or negative.
Okay, and how does that reveal bias?
If someone is faster at categorizing negative words after seeing a black face, it suggests they have an implicit negative association.
Wow, that's subtle.
It is, and studies have shown that these implicit biases can actually predict real-world behavior, like how people interact with someone of a different race.
So, even if we say we're not prejudiced, our unconscious biases can still affect our actions.
It's a sobering thought.
The book also mentions lie detectors.
Yeah, the polygraph test. Turns out it's not very reliable because things like anxiety or stress can trigger a guilty response, even in innocent people.
So it's more like a stress detector.
Kind of. It's definitely not foolproof.
Okay, let's talk about priming.
Priming is when exposure to certain concepts or stimuli unconsciously influences our thoughts, feelings, or behaviors.
Give us an example.
Okay, in one study, people read a description of this guy named Donald. His actions were kind of ambiguous, could be seen as positive or negative. But before reading about Donald, they did this word association task. Some were primed with positive words, some with negative words.
And those words influenced how they saw Donald.
Yep. The people who were primed with positive words liked Donald more.
Wow, so just seeing certain words can color our judgment of someone.
It can.
The book also talks about priming related to intelligence.
Yes, there's this study where people were subtly primed with the stereotype of a professor or a secretary before taking a trivia test. And the ones who were primed with professor actually did better.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Just thinking about a professor made them smarter.
In a way, yes. It suggests that even activating a stereotype associated with intelligence can boost cognitive performance.
Wow.
And then there's stereotype threat and stereotype enhancement.
Tell us about those.
Stereotype threat is when reminding people of a negative stereotype about their group, like women and math, actually hurts their performance because of the added anxiety.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Kind of. And stereotype enhancement is the opposite. Reminding people of a positive stereotype about their group can sometimes improve performance.
So priming can work both ways. But doesn't this make us feel like puppets, controlled by these subtle cues?
Well, the book does address that concern. These priming effects are real, but they're usually stronger in controlled lab settings. In the real world, things are much more complex, and individual differences matter too. Priming a stereotype won't work if you don't already believe in that stereotype.
So it's more like a nudge than a mind control device.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about behavioral confirmation, or self-fulfilling prophecies.
This is when our expectations about someone lead us to act in a way that elicits the very behavior we expected.
So we create the reality we expect.
Exactly. There's this classic study with a guest speaker. When students were told he was warm and friendly, they interacted with him more positively, and he ended up giving a more engaging talk. But when students were told he was cold and unfriendly, they were more reserved, and he gave a less engaging talk.
So their expectations literally change his behavior.
They did. And there's another study about phone conversations. Men were given photos of women they were told they'd be talking to. Some photos were of attractive women, some weren't.
And I bet the men who thought they were talking to attractive women acted differently.
You bet. They were warmer and more sociable. And get this, the women on the other end of the line, who hadn't seen any photos, actually responded in a warmer and more sociable way, too.
So the men's expectations actually elicited the behavior they expected from the women.
It's pretty amazing.
Okay, let's talk about how positive social interactions can sometimes lead to, well, questionable beliefs.
The book talks about this study on ESP where they manipulated two things: how involved people were in a supposed telepathy task and the level of good vibes between them, how much rapport they felt.
Okay, and did the good vibes affect their belief in ESP?
They did. The people who felt a stronger connection with their partner were more likely to believe they had telepathic abilities, even though their actual performance was no better than chance.
So feeling connected to someone can make us more gullible.
It seems so. Those positive feelings can sometimes cloud our judgment.
That's interesting. Now, for a really counterintuitive idea, the book suggests that we initially believe every statement we understand.
Right. It challenges the idea that we first understand and then decide whether to believe.
So we believe by default.
It seems so. There's this study where people read true and false statements about a crime, and some were distracted while reading. The distracted ones were more likely to be influenced by the false statements.
So if we're not paying attention, we're more likely to believe lies.
That's the takeaway. Critical thinking takes effort.
Okay, let's move on to social influence, conformity, and obedience.
This is about how other people affect our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Conformity is going along with the group, while obedience is following orders from authority.
The book mentions the Asch conformity studies where people agreed with obviously wrong answers just to fit in.
Right, they went along to get along. And the more cohesive the group, the stronger the pressure to conform.
And then there's obedience to authority.
The Milgram experiments. A classic, but also very controversial.
Remind us what those were about.
Participants were told they were in a learning experiment and had to deliver electric shocks to another person when they got answers wrong.
But the shocks weren't real, right?
No, the learner was an actor. But the participants didn't know that.
So how many people went all the way, delivering the highest shock level?
A surprisingly high number, over 60% in some variations of the study.
That's disturbing.
It is. It shows how powerful the pressure to obey authority can be, even when it goes against our moral conscience.
It makes you wonder what you would do in that situation.
It definitely does.
Okay, let's talk about de-individuation.
This is when people lose their sense of self-awareness and individual responsibility in a group setting, which can lead to uninhibited behavior.
Like mob mentality.
Exactly. There's a study where kids were trick-or-treating. The ones who were anonymous and in groups were more likely to take extra candy.
So anonymity and being part of a group can make us act out?
It can. But de-individuation isn't always bad. It can also lead to pro-social behavior, like helping others, if the cues are right.
That's interesting. Okay, let's move on to attribution theory.
This is about how we explain the causes of behavior, both our own and others.
And we tend to make some systematic errors, right?
We do. There's the fundamental attribution error, where we overestimate the role of personality and underestimate the role of the situation when explaining other people's behavior.
Like, if someone cuts us off in traffic, we think they're a jerk, not that they might be late for something important.
Exactly. And then there's the actor-observer bias, where we do the opposite when explaining our own behavior. We focus on the situation, not our personality.
So if we cut someone off in traffic, it's because we were distracted, not because we're jerks.
Right. And the book describes this study where people were asked if they'd engage in illegal activity, like breaking into a store.
And I'm guessing the situation played a big role in their answers.
It did. People were much more likely to say yes if they thought they could get away with it, even if they considered themselves honest.
So the perceived consequences, the situation, really mattered.
It did. And these attribution biases have big implications for how we treat others.
Because if we think someone's behavior is due to their personality, we might judge them more harshly.
Exactly. We might not cut them any slack.
Okay, let's talk about social facilitation and social loafing.
Social facilitation is the idea that the presence of others can affect our performance, sometimes helping, sometimes hurting.
Like stage fright.
Kind of. But it's not just about being nervous. There's this theory that the presence of others increases arousal, which can improve performance on easy tasks, but hurt performance on difficult tasks.
So if you're good at something, an audience might help you. But if you're still learning, it might make you choke.
Exactly.
And what about social loafing?
That's the tendency to put in less effort when you're part of a group because your individual contribution is less noticeable.
Like group projects in school.
Yeah.
Everyone slacks off because they think someone else will pick up the slack.
Exactly. It's the free rider problem.
Okay, let's move on to social identity and intergroup relations.
This is about how our sense of self is tied to the groups we belong to.
Like our race, gender, religion, sports team.
All of that. And we get a boost to our self-esteem when our group does well. The book calls this basking in reflected glory.
Like wearing your team's jersey after they win a big game.
Exactly. And we do the opposite when our group fails, cutting off reflected failure.
So we distance ourselves from the losers.
It's a way to protect our ego.
The book also talks about stereotypes.
Stereotypes are those generalized beliefs about groups of people, and they can be very resistant to change.
Because we tend to notice information that confirms our stereotypes and ignore information that disconfirms them.
Right, and stereotypes can overlap and interact. Like stereotypes about women might be different for Black women versus white women.
It's all very complex.
It is.
Okay, let's finish up with the science of close relationships.
This is a fascinating area of social psychology that looks at the dynamics of our closest bonds.
The book talks about the inclusion of other in the self, which is the idea that we start to see our close others as part of ourselves.
There's this study where people were better at remembering words that were related to themselves or their mother compared to words related to a celebrity.
So we process information about our loved ones similarly to how we process information about ourselves.
Exactly. It shows how deeply connected we become.
And then there's social exchange theory, which looks at the costs and rewards of relationships.
Right, like a balance sheet.
And finally, let's talk about social exclusion and aggression.
This is a really important topic because it's linked to some really tragic real-world events like school shootings.
The book mentions the Columbine shooters, right?
Yes, their studies talked about feeling like outcasts. And research has shown that being socially excluded can increase aggression.
Like if someone is left out of a group activity, they might lash out at the people who excluded them.
It's a natural human response, unfortunately. And it's not just directed at the people who excluded us. We might take it out on innocent bystanders, too.
That's scary. So social exclusion can have serious consequences.
It can. It's important to be aware of that.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What are some of the key takeaways?
Well, we've seen that our minds are more complex than we often realize. We're not always aware of our own motivations, our memories can be unreliable, and we're susceptible to all sorts of biases.
And the social context, the people around us, have a huge influence on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Absolutely. We're social creatures to our core.
So what's one final provocative thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Given all that we've learned about the power of unconscious biases, I think it's worth asking ourselves, what steps can we consciously take to promote fairer and more equitable interactions?
That's a great question. Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of social psychology.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you some insights into yourself and the people around you. Until next time, keep diving deep.